if an Ofsted team are going into a school in a really tough area, which is dominated by gangs, which is dominated by drugs, and that school has a quality, structured, rigid behaviour system that is also supporting students with their needs, and students are going in there feeling safe, and students are going in there feeling as though their social atmosphere is transformed from what it is outside, and yet because of outcomes, that school is still branded requires improvement, that is disgraceful. Hello, I'm Tom Rogers, and this is the Rebel Education Podcast. This is a brand new podcast aimed at reflecting what's really happening in educational institutions in the United Kingdom and beyond. In each podcast, we're going to be talking about the particular challenges that educators are facing on the ground, and they're going to tell us what's really happening. In each episode, we're going to hear from leaders in education who are going to hopefully offer solutions to some of those problems and challenges. I will be your host. I'm Tom Rogers. I'm a TES columnist and history teacher in Vigo, Spain. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at Rogers History or visit my website at rogershistory.com. This podcast is going to be a must listen. We aren't going to sugarcoat anything. This is going to be as real as it gets. I'm absolutely delighted that you've chosen to spend a bit of time with me, and I promise I'll try and be nice. If you want to buy me a drink or support the upkeep of this podcast, then please check out the Patreon link attached on the Podbean page. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Education Podcast. This week we are talking about Ofsted. Should the inspectorate be abolished? Should it be destroyed and consigned to the dustbin of history? And this whole debate kicked off a few weeks ago in a Twitter spat between Mary Bowstead, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Teaching Union, and Sean Harford, who is the Inspectorate's National Director of Education. And it followed a TES article in which Mary Bowstead said that Amanda Spielman was not a safe pair of hands. And in this article, Mary spoke about or stated the fact that Amanda Spielman has never taught a lesson and never set foot in a classroom. This wound some people up the wrong way. They started to question Mary's credibility, but as far as my humble opinion is, all she did in the article was state the fact that Amanda Spielman has not taught in a school. Following a tweet from a former head teacher called Colin, which said simply, all unions and Ofsted should be working with schools for a common good. Sean Harford replied to that tweet with, I would agree about working together, but the problem is the National Education Union has continually called and still calls for the abolition of Ofsted, which makes working together to improve things impossible. I read that tweet very clearly as we, Ofsted, refuse to work with anybody who calls for who even proposes our abolition. This, remember, is a public body. Ofsted is publicly funded by the taxpayer. It is a body that has been set up to inspect schools, to judge schools, to look at school standards. It does that through a series of inspections conducted at various different lengths of time. And there's been controversy recently about some so-called outstanding schools that haven't been inspected for 10 years plus. But broadly, you're looking at between 3 and 5 years for an Ofsted inspection. Nowadays, that can be 2 to 3 days, and the judgments follow an outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate model. I've argued very much in the past that they are based on outcomes predominantly. So in other words, the test results that the students get is the predominant marker in an Ofsted judgment, and all the data and all the evidence backs that up. However, we're going to come on to the problems later. Let's focus on this debate between Mary Bowstead and Sean Harford. So Sean said this, and Mary replied with, the National Education Union does call for Ofsted's abolition. Ofsted claimed it could judge teacher quality in 20-minute lesson observations. It promoted triple marking. It had to purge 1,200 inspectors because they weren't good enough. It spearheaded the drive for data, which takes up lots of teacher time. And Sean Harford said back, and the first sentence right there, Mary, sets out why it's impossible under your leadership to try to work with your union to improve things for all in education, which leaves a lot of teachers as your members without a credible voice at the table. And somebody else described that tweet from Mr. Harford as a shocking admission in refusing to work with a majority of teachers because they don't agree with him. And, I have to agree with that. So the debate is, in this podcast, is Sean Harford right that the abolition of Ofsted is unspeakable and unthinkable? Or is it actually logical? Is it the right thing to do? And in the interest of balance in this podcast, we're going to hear from different teachers and educationalists who believe in both sides of this argument. So we have J.L. Dutout, who is going to talk to you about the fact that he does not believe that Ofsted should be abolished. Rob Brown is a maths teacher who is also going to argue that Ofsted should not be abolished. And against them, arguing for Ofsted's abolition, or certainly, I'm not going to speak for them, but certainly Mary Bousted on this podcast will be arguing for Ofsted's abolition. And there will be other voices like Ross McGill and Paul Garvey, who, although I haven't listened to their contribution at time of recording, I'm pretty sure that they are going to be airing many grievances and certainly on the side of abolition or close to it. So we're certainly going to hear a very balanced survey, if you like, of views on Ofsted. What is my view? What are the problems with Ofsted? Well, I agree with the National Association of Head Teachers, the NAHT. They recently unveiled key findings about Ofsted, and there were 5 of them. And they said Ofsted cannot deliver reliable judgments about schools. I agree. We have seen, and there was a recent blog by Stephen Tierney, which outlined discrepancies in the way that Ofsted biases in the way that Ofsted judge schools. For example, it is much harder to get a good or outstanding rating if you are a school in a deprived area of the United Kingdom. This is a fact. It's much harder to get a good or outstanding rating. So why is that? Is that because the teachers aren't as good? Well, of course it's not. And I have argued in the past, and I will continue to argue, that if you were to take the entire staff from a so-called outstanding school and you were to swap them with the entire staff in a requires improvement school, I honestly don't believe the grading would change within 2 years. There are several reasons I feel that. One is that I feel that much of Ofsted's outcomes are based on results, and I feel that those results are not the teachers' results, they're the students' results. And I could cite research from King's College London. I could cite research from the American Statistical Association. I could cite lots and lots of research which confirms that hereditary factors, parental involvement, environmental factors have the massive predominant impact on student attainment and results and outcomes. They are the things that influence it the most. By far. And I put a block figure of between 10 and 20% as the impact that a teacher can have on student results on average. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions. However, Ofsted are judging as though it's almost like 80 to 90% of impact that a teacher can have. But the research just doesn't add up on this. And funnily enough, Sean Harford himself actually agreed. He said, I can believe that, Tom, when I put to him on Twitter that it was a 10 to 20% teacher factor. He actually agreed with that. He said, yeah, I can buy into that. So, therefore, why does Ofsted judge teachers on their students' results? It's beyond me. But anyway, what this then means is that obviously schools and families in deprived areas, they might not benefit from the cultural capital that schools do in the leafy suburbs. And of course, the more money you have, the more access you have to private tutors who might be able to improve your performance in things like the SATs or even later on in GCSEs. There are so many factors we could put in there, but ultimately, it's just not fair. It's a data-led process. I mean, Ofsted are only in there for 2 days. So people talk about, being scared of Ofsted. Yeah. Be scared of Ofsted, but not when they're in there, because in my view, they've already made the judgment, and that's borne out in the statistics, because we know that it's a minute percentage of schools that have outcomes that are perceived to be less than good, that get a good Ofsted or above. So essentially this is a data process, and when they go in for the 2 days, it's a checking process. It's to see if there's any safeguarding issues. It's to see if there's any major flaws in things. Essentially, an idea has been gathered. And of course, it works the other way. If the idea is a negative one from the data, accusations have been made that there are almost, in inverted commas, lines of inquiry during inspection. Okay, I'm going to prove in these 2 days that this school requires improvement to suit my pre-made narrative. And it's not fair. So that's one criticism. The second one is inspections create needless work. Now, this is one where, we can talk all we want about OFSTED myths and the fact that OFSTED have clarified that they don't need to see this and they don't need to see that. But if you are a school who has special measures or requires improvement, or even a good school that feels that their results are on a downward trend, you're almost under the impression that if you don't have something to show, to say, here's our interventions on paper, here's all the data we've collected, here's all the CPD we've done, here's this, here's that, and an evidence trail. If your results are good, you almost need that evidence trail to prove that you've been doing something about it. So as much as Amanda Spielman's talking about curriculum, she's saying, we're going to have a rich curriculum, a knowledge-rich curriculum, and teachers are going to be able to go off on a tangent, and we want teachers to be expansive with how they teach, and so on. That's all well and good. But if your results do not match up, does that mean that Ofsted are going to say that's okay, that you've gone off on a tangent, that you've done what you wanted, that you haven't collected enough evidence? Does that mean they're going to change their approach as well? This is where I just can't see the add up myself between these two. The new framework comes out next year. At the moment, it's not entirely clear what's going to be on it, but certainly the outcomes grade is going to go. So outcomes is going to come out of the framework. It's going to be quality of teaching and learning. Okay. But how are you going to judge that in 2 days? So what kind of role is data going to play? My suspicion is it's still going to play a major role. And yet we have all this talk about curriculum and the niceties of curriculum. That's lovely, and I completely agree with Amanda Spielman. But let's see the reality then. Let's let teachers teach a curriculum. But if we're going to judge it on student results, we're going to have problems. And the third criticism, that head teachers can feel a sense of panic and vulnerability. Of course they can. We know that when a school gets a poor Ofsted judgment, it then prompts a series of processes in the school to intervene, lots more pressure on staff, real problems in schools, lots of staff considering leaving. This happens. Teachers leave schools because of Ofsted judgments when they've tried their hearts out and they are labelled and brandished with this judgment. And it's this tick box culture that's created as a result of can be created as a result of inspection. Do we blame school leaders? Well, we'll talk about that in another podcast. But this is what the NAHT have said, that compliance to Ofsted creates a tick box culture. So Ofsted is at a crossroads, and there are those who are saying that it should be abolished, like Mary Bowstead, and there are those who are saying it could just be reformed. Reforms that I personally have suggested in the past are that the outcomes should not play such a key role in inspection. I've also suggested that teacher well-being and teacher retention rates per school should form part of any framework and should have equal weighting with outcomes and everything else. I've argued that we should be listening to what parents want. There was a DFE survey just this year of parents that found their top 3 concerns about a school would be the quality of teaching and staff, the happiness of children, and how the school deals with bullying. So there is nothing in those top 3 about progress or attainment of students. In fact, out of 1,128 parents who were surveyed, only small percentages mention progress and attainment. So 32% mention the progress and attainment in maths, 30% in reading, 29% in writing as important. They labelled other things much more important than that. Behaviour, for example, featured much more heavily in the feedback. So my point is, if an Ofsted team are going into a school in a really tough area, which is dominated by gangs, which is dominated by drugs, and that school has a quality, structured, rigid behaviour system that is also supporting students with their needs, and students are going in there feeling safe, and students are going in there feeling as though their social atmosphere is transformed from what it is outside, and yet because of outcomes, that school is still branded requires improvement, that is disgraceful, in my opinion. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the teachers in there are doing incredible jobs under immense pressure. And yet they're still, at the moment, many of these schools are still being judged requires improvement or inadequate even sometimes. I must say, on the inadequate rating, you would think that to get inadequate, there would have to be some serious concerns, but I'm not an expert on that. But certainly on the requires improvement grading, it often just comes down to outcomes, which is really, really sad. Those who say that Ofsted should be abolished will look at countries like Finland or Australia, who've got rid of the inspectorate completely. Wales has recently suspended all inspections for a year. They've made an almost Trumpist statement of, we want time to figure out what the hell is going on, because teachers in Wales, it's happening the same as in England. They're quitting, they want to leave, they're under pressure. Wales has just stalled on it. They've just said, listen, we need to stop ESTIN. Obviously, they don't have Ofsted in Wales, they have ESTIN. Similar thing, but they've said we need to stall this. Ofsted's budget, they got £138 million a year. And recently I published on my Twitter account the bonuses that were awarded. There are many leaders in Ofsted who are receiving bonuses of 10, 15, even £20,000 in a year. We have no idea what the specific targets are. What targets are they hitting to achieve these bonuses? Ofsted won't tell us. There was a recent FOI request on this, and Ofsted said we can't reveal the data of individual targets. Well, even anonymised. So the FOI request was not asking for the names and the targets. It was just asking for the targets, just to see what the targets are. And the reason they haven't been revealed is we know perfectly well what those targets will be. If you perform more inspections in schools that are in deprived areas, you get a bonus. If schools move from requires improvement to good, I'm just putting things out there now. But if these were the targets on those forms, it would be scandalous. Let's be honest, especially when you consider that teachers are never going to get a bonus for anything, ever. Okay? So, the fact is should the inspectorate be abolished? As I've said earlier, we've got some guests on the podcast, which is fantastic. And first up, we're going to hear the opinion of Rob Brown. Rob is a maths teacher. He is speaking in a personal capacity, I have to say that and reiterate that. And his view is that Ofsted should not be abolished. And I want to thank him in advance for coming on the podcast. It's a fantastic summary that he's given. So listen to Rob, and then we'll and have a think what you think while you're listening.
As a teacher, when I'm looking for a new school, the first thing I look at is the most recent inspection report. And I wouldn't mind betting it's the same for most parents choosing a school. Whatever the caveats associated with an inspection, whatever subjectivities involved, a school's inspection report remains the most valuable information we have about a school. There's no shortage of data in education. We have attainment data, progress data, exclusions data, contextual data in RAIS, information on school finance, teaching staff, cohort size relative to capacity, parent questionnaires in parent view. There's no shortage of information. An inspector's job is to take that information along with talking to head teachers, governors, teachers, pupils, to correctly interpret the data, all of the data as a whole, and to use this along with their experience, along with their expertise, to arrive at a fair and balanced opinion of that school. It's a tough job. Without an inspectorate, we'd be left with the media making headlines out of whatever bit of data is released that week. We'd be left with head teachers and academy trusts spinning the data to sell their schools. Politicians clinging on to any possible bit of good news to conclude that they've revolutionised the education system. You'd have people taking the data out of context, deliberately or because they don't know what they're talking about, and people will report on schools anyway. I'd rather have an independent inspectorate reporting on the data and being paid to do this properly. Now, it must be horrible to be on the wrong end of a bad inspection. Perhaps a decent school with good data, but for whatever reason deemed to be requiring improvement. These errors, I'm sure, happen. There are thousands of inspections each year, all conducted by humans. There will be mistakes. And it must be horrible, and I do mean horrible. If you're deemed to require improvement, you'll have more frequent inspections, for one, but you might attract fewer pupils and get less money. If you have bad leadership, then workload might increase, more observations, and just more pressure coming down on teachers. The effects really can be horrible, but I'm afraid these errors are somewhat inevitable and a risk we have to take. Because I want to find the schools that need to be in special measures. When a school's put in special measures, everyone in the whole nation knows that that school is terrible. There's either a safeguarding concern or the quality of education is consistently and persistently atrocious. Schools in special measures are not acceptable, and the consequences are already high. Parents flee the school. It's not just that you don't get as many year 7s or year 1s, but parents remove their students from the school. The school loses funding. Head teachers are sacked, quite often now. Governing bodies are replaced sometimes. Academy trusts can be replaced, very rarely. You'll be inspected again in 3 months. This is accountability, and I want this accountability. I don't want there to be an excuse for failure. I don't want there to be a place for failing schools to hide. It's awful to be a part of, and I've been there. I've been in a school, a maths teacher, when it's been put into special measures, and it's painful, it's tiring, it's stressful, it's hard work, and you can take it personally. But students in this country should not have to suffer inadequate education. And after all, that is what OFSTED call it. Inadequate education. I want accountability, and I want these schools improved. It gets even more pressing than that. Ofsted say that not only do we have a bunch of failing schools, but they say that schools in deprived areas are worse, that they have a lower overall standard of education. Quality of teaching is worse, standards of behaviour are worse. This is all in the Ofsted data. They have fewer resources, they have lower outcomes. Schools in deprived areas do worse in every single way. Ofsted report this every year without fail in their annual report, and there seems to be a school of thought that wants to shoot the messenger, that seeks to blame Ofsted for the underperformance that it reports in our schools, and consequently seeks to blame Ofsted for stress on teachers or for the inequalities we observe in the education system. Well, I'll tell you who I blame. I blame the government for severely underfunding schools. I blame a series of governments for tinkering with things that don't matter. The best way to get money into schools, what kind of academies we have, whether we need free schools or not, more or less grammars, and not focusing on things that matter. They don't focus on getting good teachers in front of students who are there to learn, with an appropriate curriculum, with strong school leadership. The government get it wrong. And for some reason this turns into some kind of educational civil war between Ofsted and teachers, which it should not be. The demand for Ofsted is clear. Parents eagerly await reports, attend meetings, sometimes even request a new inspection for their school. Local media await inspection reports and sell newspapers off the back of them. Even pupils want to know what inspectors think about their school, and then that is a reflection on them. Ofsted should be concerned with ensuring as many reports as possible are the best, most accurate representation of the schools. But more importantly, what are we going to do about schools deemed inadequate? What are we going to do as an educational system about the inequality that Ofsted identifies year on year? The question isn't really, is Ofsted good? But the question is, how are we going to improve the educational system? And Ofsted are not the answer to that, but they must play its part in telling us whether the schools are improving and whether they're any good or not. We cannot bury our head in the sand.
And thanks very much to Rob for coming on the podcast. Really respect the fact that he's taken the time out of his busy schedule as a full-time maths teacher to come on the podcast and share his view that Ofsted should not be abolished. A few interesting things that he was saying. He was talking about the fact that parents want Ofsted. The first thing parents do is look at an Ofsted report. I think personally there's truth in that. I think the bit where I'm disputing it is the reliability of those reports. Parents do want a reference point. Does that need to come from Ofsted? I think it sounds like Rob has a lot of faith in the data behind the Ofsted judgments, or what Ofsted are using to base their judgments on, whether that be Progress 8, whether that be GCSE attainment, whether that be even what they see in a 2-day inspection visit. Personally, I cannot put as much faith as he does in those judgments and on the data that lie behind the judgments, and that would be my concern. So anyway, nice comments from Rob, and again, thank you so much to him for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate his time. We're going to hear now from the counter argument. We're going to hear now from somebody who feels passionately that Ofsted not only needs to go, but also has a solution in its place, and that is Mary Bowstead, who is the joint president of the NEA Teaching Union. Let's hear what Mary has to say now.
Should Ofsted be abolished? Yes, it should. But Ofsted would need to be replaced by a different and, in my view, much better inspection and accountability system. Ofsted needs to be abolished because the agency has reached the end of the road in terms of its ability to assess school quality and its reputation. The study by the Education Policy Institute, Inspection is There Room to Improve, in 2016, was very, very critical of Ofsted and showed beyond any doubt that schools in the leafy suburbs with advantaged pupil intakes, even if they showed a marked and significant decline in their educational attainment as measured by value-added progress, they were still disproportionately likely to be rated good or outstanding, whereas schools in more challenging areas, if they showed the same increase in value-added progress, were disproportionately likely still to remain requires improvement or inadequate. And that leads me to my first conclusion. A civil servant said to me recently, I don't need Ofsted to tell me which schools educate middle-class children. In other words, Ofsted's much better at assessing the socio-economic background of the intake of the school than it is about school quality. But that has a wider consequence. That schools in challenging areas most need the best teachers and most need the best school leaders. But if it becomes a career-threatening move to go into those schools because you are not going to be recognised for the progress you're making with children who are already severely disadvantaged, if that becomes a career-threatening move, then that means that those schools find it more difficult to attract the best school leaders and teachers, and they most need them. And we know that that is the case. We know that schools in challenging areas find it more difficult to get teachers who are qualified in the subjects which they're teaching. So, for example, in subjects like physics and maths and even like English, the most deprived schools find it most difficult to get well-qualified teachers who are teaching the subject they are qualified in. And that lack of well-qualified teachers is another reason why Ofsted has reached the end of the road. We now know that 40% of teachers leave within 5 years of qualifying. That's 50% for maths and science. We know that the leaving rate for teachers within 5 years is getting worse. More teachers are leaving early. And when you ask teachers why they leave, and the 44,000 teachers who responded to the workload survey, the thing that they put at the top of the reason for driving them from the profession is accountability, both external accountability and in-school accountability measures. And Ofsted is a major reason why in England we now have in too many schools a culture where there is low trust of teachers, where there is very high workloads, and where much of that work is spent on bureaucracy, which has nothing to do with teaching and learning, around lesson planning, and around dialogic marking, and around the absurd and ridiculous drive for data, much of it spurious, in order to demonstrate progress. Ofsted has a terrible track record about what it has imposed on schools. Remember, this is the agency which said that you could assess progress within 20 minutes. Ofsted is the agency which said that lesson observations were a good way of assessing teacher quality. And Ofsted is behind much of the drive for data to demonstrate progress, which takes up so many hours of teachers' wasted time. But finally, now Ofsted is trying to recreate itself as an agency which has learned lessons. And the new inspection framework is, Amanda Spielman says, is going to measure ambition in the curriculum. I fail to see how Ofsted inspectors, who have so gravely misunderstood data and have ended so many teachers and school leaders' careers on spurious judgment, how that is an agency which is going to tool itself up to measure ambition in the curriculum. And my doubts are shared by a wide range of, you might say, unsuspected allies, including Rachel D'Souza, Russell Hobby, and, so I understand, the Department for Education and Damien Hines. I do not understand and I do not believe that Ofsted as an agency can change its spots and start measuring something as technical and as ambitious as the curriculum. So we need a new system of inspection. The NEU believes that we should have local inspection, which is quality assured by HMI. We should move away from single Ofsted judgments, which are ridiculous. They can't measure the variation of teaching quality in a school. And we should move to much more nuanced judgments and a system which combines improvement with accountability, very much as London did in London Challenge, and that transformed London schools from one of the poorest performing areas in the country to a beacon throughout the world for improved education performance. So there are other models, and my final point is this. Very few high-performing systems inspect as we do. We invented Ofsted. We can invent something better.
Thanks to Mary Bowstead. Massive thanks to Mary Bowstead for coming on the podcast and sharing her views there. What do you think? We've heard from two interviewees so far, one on the side of not abolishing Ofsted and obviously one that is in favour. What do you think? If you want to share your views, please tweet at me at Rogers History with whatever you think, or visit my website at rogershistory.com and visit the page on the Rebel Education podcast and leave your comments there. Love to hear from you, to know what you're thinking so far, not only of what we're discussing today, but of the podcast in general. Your views matter to me, and I will always endeavour to make the podcast better and more suitable to listeners, whoever you may be, and we might only have about one or two this week, but who knows. So moving on, we've heard from Rob and we've heard from Mary, and we're now going to hear from another person who is in favour of keeping the inspectorate going, and that is J.L. Dutout, who is the joint editor of a book called Flip the System, with Lucy Rycroft Smith. It's a book well worth getting your hands on if you can. And JL is in favour of keeping the inspectorate. So we're going to hear what he has to say next.
Hi, I'm JL Duto. I'm a teacher of citizenship and politics and the co-editor of Flip the System UK, a teacher's manifesto. Now, in response to a number of negative stories about Ofsted recently, that have included suggestions its inspection outcomes are biased, as well as the research that informs its internal processes, controversial statements from its chief inspector about white working class communities lacking the aspiration of their migrant counterparts, and that funding pressures aren't impacting educational outcomes, and many more. The NEU has amplified its long-standing call to scrap the organisation. Now, that's been the policy of the unions for years, and I suspect the true reason for the recent renewing of these calls has more to do with the political conference season and Labour's fledgling National Education Service policy than anything Ofsted has done differently. To be fair to it, when has Ofsted not been embattled? At source, the problem seems to me to be that Ofsted isn't independent, despite what anyone at the DFE or within the inspectorate says. And this really is a problem. Kevin Courtney is right when he says that Ofsted can't speak truth to power, but I disagree strongly that it should be abolished for all that. There are inherent dangers. Now, the NEU has a plan to replace Ofsted with mutually supportive local inspection and improvement partnerships. I love the idea, but no policy document I've seen relating to this answers all my questions about their makeup and their accountability, and that's a big issue, because the risk is we just repeat the weaknesses of Ofsted, but in a fragmented way, potentially worsening educational inequity as a result. Well, and in the meantime, Labour isn't in power, and let's face it, there's no realistic political chance of a Conservative government implementing the union's policy. But there is a real risk that the government might abolish Ofsted, and this should concern us because their vision of what to replace it with will be entirely different. Its view of democracy is firmly based on parliamentary representation and the legitimacy of manifesto mandates, and not at all on grassroots professional-led or informed policy. Waiting in the wings are the office of the National Schools Commissioner, the Regional Schools Commissioners, and the nominally elected head teachers panels who advise them. We should all be very worried that what comes to take Ofsted's place and pass as a proxy for localism and better accountability could actually be more politicised than what it's replacing. In today's climate of political doublespeak, where less money is record funding and grammar schools help social mobility, and there's never been a better time than the recruitment and retention crisis to become a teacher. This is the worst possible outcome for the unions, who would comprehensively have lost the political battle to democratise our school system and push back the marketisation agenda. Better, in my view, to outflank the politicians on all sides. The unions should declare themselves outright supporters of Ofsted. Accountability is, after all, an important marker of professionalism. Better to keep working on Ofsted's reform through good faith conversation until a political opening arises to be more radical. Who knows, by then the most radical thing might actually have turned out to be to keep Ofsted and make it truly independent.
And that was JL. Thank you, JL. Brilliant orator, isn't he? Sounds a bit like a smoother version of Churchill, maybe. I don't know what I'm talking about, but it was very well put from JL, very well argued. Thank you so much for contributing to the podcast. The final two guests we have on this podcast, which is discussing should Ofsted be abolished, are Paul Garvey, who is an educational consultant and author, followed by Ross Morrison-McGill, also known as Teacher Toolkit. Really appreciate these two gents coming on the podcast. I share many of their views and concerns on the inspectorate.
Hello, Paul Garvey. I inspected for 11 years. My first inspection was in the old Section 10, where we had an enormous team. It was completely unwieldy. It lasted 4 days and it was hell for the school. During those inspections I led many and I teamed on many as well. So I have a lot of experience of inspection basically. I'd always supported Ofsted and always said that we needed a strong inspectorate. Well, we need somebody, but my views have changed markedly on that over the last couple of years. We need something maybe along the lines of the NEU's suggestions, but we don't need Ofsted anymore. The senior leadership in Ofsted over the last 2 years have changed in the way they operate. They now clearly support a particular agenda in pedagogy and curriculum. That's not what Ofsted should do. Ofsted's inspectors are told, with a must in the handbook, not to do this. The National Director and HMCI have both done this several times over the last couple of years, and especially recently. Secondly, Ofsted are extremely unfair in the inspection of schools facing challenging circumstances, SCCs. They inspect by VA, and the numbers of SCCs that are in RI or special measures compared to those in advantage catchments are far too high. As well as that, the numbers of schools that are outstanding and are SCCs are far too low compared to, again, schools in more advantaged circumstances. The combination of those two has caused me to change my mind, and I know through contacts with them that these schools, that is, have faced horrendous difficulties, and the complaints procedure is completely unfit for purpose. So, I've changed my mind from being a supporter of a strong Ofsted to Ofsted must go. #OMG Edu. Thanks for giving me the chance to talk. Bye.
Should Ofsted be abolished? Hello, my name is Ross McGill. This is my comments for a podcast by Tom Rogers. I'm going to keep my thoughts very simple. I'm going to try and offer 2 points of view. The first point of view is, of course, we should have Ofsted because we need schools to be held account. We want schools to maintain higher standards. And I believe where schools that have been exempt for over a decade in some cases from inspection, or those schools, for example, promoting extremism or what have you, that raise very, very serious safeguarding concerns, of course we should have a mechanism where we can inspect those schools. But that aside, I believe that Ofsted, its grading culture, for at least the time I've been in schools, 25 years, has driven behaviours on the classroom floor. And we just look at latest dialogue, changing frameworks, where the goalposts shift for whatever reason, whether we get more immersed with research or we see the damage that certain statements may have had in the school inspection handbook. Then we can see why schools, teachers, head teachers have danced along for performances when 2 or 5 people turn up to your school for a day, maybe 2, and ask you to put your best foot forward. We all know that that doesn't give a true picture of all the hard work that people do behind the scenes. I also know of countless head teachers who have contacted me, and this is going into the tens and tens and tens of lots of head teachers who've sent me various messages in good faith behind the scenes about the damage that an Ofsted judgment has come for, whatever reason, looking at data incorrectly, etc. We look at the independence. So, are Ofsted a puppet for DfE policy? We also look at value for money, with reducing budgets, Ofsted having less of a budget and having less of a team. Can they truly inspect every school across the country? We look at Ofsted bonuses, taxpayer money. I could go on and on and on. The walls are closing in my opinion. And with the new September 2019 framework being revised and a focus on curriculum, we have a window of opportunity to do something truly remarkable, groundbreaking, and I don't think we are going to achieve this because I think it's devil the better you know type of thing, that if we keep doing the same things, we're going to get the same outcomes. We're going to still lose good people to the profession. We are going to have people chasing Ofsted headlines and all sorts of things. But I just don't think anyone at the very top has the bravado to do this. And I know we all have someone to hold us to account. We all are accountable, and we all want the best for every child. But when you choose to work in a tough school, and the demographics might go against you, we might have 3-year trends on the horizon, and hopefully we also have schools grouped within families of schools. But to keep the Ofsted rhetoric of outstanding or inadequate, we will simply have another generation of the same old accolades, good people leaving the profession, one school saying we're outstanding, whilst another school and all its colleagues hiding away, wondering what they're doing wrong. It's quite simple. Ofsted need rapid reform. I think they should still exist. I think they should certainly inspect schools for safeguarding and do some simple quality control checks, but then advocating how to do certain things, and particularly with curriculum, I think we need to do something different.
And that was Paul Garvey and Ross Morrison-McGill talking about should Ofsted be abolished. Thank you so much for joining in with this podcast by listening. Thank you very much. Please do subscribe to the podcast. We are on YouTube, we are on Podbean, we are on iTunes. Make sure you subscribe if you've enjoyed the podcast. You might not have, but I hope you have, because I certainly have. I think it's been absolutely fascinating to hear the views of all our contributors today. I'd like to thank all the contributors on this podcast. I look forward to the next one. So please join us in a week's time for the next instalment of the Rebel Education podcast. In the meantime, if you'd like to get involved, please tweet me at Rogers History, or go to my website, rogershistory.com, and visit the Rebel Education podcast page, where there is a message board where you can post your comments in response to any of the podcasts you've heard. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.